evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. Welcome here in person, also by live stream. Tonight we are celebrating Gareth Brandt's new book, Radical Roots, a collection of paintings, stories, and poems celebrating the 500th anniversary of Anabaptist origins. Congratulations on that release. As you all likely know, next year, 2025, marks 5 centuries of Anabaptism since its beginnings in Europe during the Protestant Reformation. I'm grateful that Gareth is able to be here from BC and will share poetry and other excerpts from his book that reflect on early Anabaptism and his own faith journey within this tradition. My name is Arlen. I am the director of Common Word, a national Anabaptist bookstore and resource center jointly operated by Canadian Mennonite University and Mennonite Church Canada, where it's possible to buy, to borrow, and to access resources online. And it's our privilege to be hosting tonight's conversation in Winnipeg, in the territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Ojibwe, Cree, and Métis nations. We gather in Treaty 1 territory, benefit daily from Treaty 3 water and Treaty 5 hydroelectricity. And those of you on live stream may be joining us from other sacred lands, and we make this acknowledgement in respect for the host peoples who have and continue to love and care for this land, and we recommit ourselves to real change that fosters reconciliation. A couple of quick notes. For those who are participating online, I invite you to send a chat message with your name and general location so we have a sense of who is joining us. This conversation is being recorded, will be kept online at commonword.ca for future viewers. After Gareth's presentation, there will be time for questions and responses. And online viewers may submit their questions via the chat function, and I will try to monitor that. After the formal part of this event, copies of Radical Roots will be available to purchase in person at Common Word or online at commonword.ca. And I will include a link to the book in the chat. And for those here in person, Gareth will be at the table to greet you and to sign your copy. Now, it's my honor to introduce tonight's author. Gareth Brandt, currently from Abbotsford, BC, is a freelance artist, itinerant speaker, and independent scholar. He was born near here in Steinbach, Manitoba. Special welcome to family, local family and friends. And has served churches in Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and BC. As a youth pastor and most recently as a college professor for more than 2 decades. He has taught spiritual formation, Anabaptist history, and Anabaptist theology. As John Sharp states in the foreword to Radical Roots, Brandt crafts a narrative seasoned beautifully with paintings and poetry and presents a feast for heart, mind, and soul. May you offer us some of that feast tonight, Gareth. Welcome here.
Thanks. It's really good to be here. And the first thing I'm going to do is, if you're okay with it, to take a picture of the audience. Because I find a lot of my worlds are colliding here. You may not know it, but that's part of living in different parts of the country, I suppose, or being in church ministry, is that you meet a lot of people in different walks of life. So this way I can share back home who is all here. So thank you very much. We got everybody there. Arlen already had a land acknowledgement, but I want to add to that and say it's important to note that 500 years ago, at the very same time that the Anabaptist movement was having its beginnings in continental Europe in the 16th century, other Europeans were in a race to explore and colonize different continents, one of which my ancestors came to hundreds of years later. Mennonites were sometimes persecuted and landless people in Europe, and were grateful for the safety and opportunity of a new continent, and often, though unaware that they were being given land taken forcefully and deceptively from indigenous people who had lived there and thrived off the land since time immemorial. And this is as true in the Red River Valley as it is in Ontario, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia. So I don't think it is coincidental that a few years after the Riel resistance in 1871, the Canadian government was welcoming European settlers, including Mennonites, to the same area that the Métis had been chased out of and were forced to further northwest, where a decade or so later, things kind of repeated again. And you may be familiar with Reserve 107 and that video that has come out about that area. Because European colonization, because European Mennonite settlers have benefited from colonialism, I see the work of decolonization, reparation, and reconciliation with our indigenous hosts as important work, and perhaps the most important work for Anabaptists at age 500. But I am here to talk about origins, not about the present, but I believe there are some connections. And so I'm thankful that I was able to do my work in the ancestral, traditional, and uniquely in British Columbia, unceded territory of the Stalo people of the river on the Pacific Northwest coast. So I think it's important to acknowledge these things as we celebrate our own spiritual, theological, and often also family history. I want to give you a bit of a personal introduction, even though you may know a part of my life. This is kind of entitled, How I Became an Anabaptist. I grew up a prairie boy, I grew up rural, I grew up separate, I grew up sheltered, I grew up low German, I grew up in the church, I grew up conservative, I grew up evangelical, I grew up Mennonite. In school they called me a Nazi, in school they called me a kraut, in school they called me a Mennonite. I wanted out. All the words meant the same to me, and they were spoken with the same tone, and it wasn't pleasant. I did not want to be a Mennonite. Did I know what it meant? Not a mite. Mennonites have bled. Mennonites have fled. Mennonites have become Alliance and Baptist and Pentecostal instead. I didn't want to bleed. I couldn't flee. There were no other churches in my community. I had no options. I left my church. I left my parents' faith. I left my Jesus. But Jesus did not leave me. My parents prayed for me. I returned to Jesus, but I thought, you know, it really bites, this thing about being Mennonite. And I had never even heard of this thing called Anabaptist. I wrote this in my journal at age 16. Ed Weeb, another preacher, came to see me about baptism into the Mennonite church. I told him no bloody way. I wasn't even a good Christian, and I told him that the church didn't seem very attractive to me because many members were backslidden and was too dry. He was hurt and asked if I needed any spiritual help. I said no, even though I did at the time. I still can't stand help from preachers. I just can't understand them. End of quote at age 16. Well, I've swallowed my words, I've swallowed my pride, my old self has died for 40 years now, I've been a Mennonite minister, I've been bona fide. Now I'm one of those hard-to-understand preachers. I chose then, later on, after 16, and I choose now to be called a Mennonite. My sister, she's not a Mennonite, even though she eats Varaniki. My pastor, she is a Mennonite, even though she's a Yamasaki. By the way, she is no longer our pastor, but the rhyme is just too good. I had to keep it. And I read this poem to her as well, and she loved it. So, how did it happen? How did I become Anabaptist? A theological movement? How did I become Mennonite? A church of the movement? Well, back to my youth, I was pretty uncouth. I flirted with a lot of churches and a few girls. My friend Dennis over here. They seemed like so much more fun than my old Mennonite one. What a shock, what a surprise. It was in public university that my faith had a reprise. Christians were ridiculed right-wing Republican warmongers, but Mennonites were known as nonviolent peacemakers. It's an offense, it didn't make sense, but I had an opportunity. I shared the Jesus story, I shared my story. My own faith came alive when I told it. Maybe I should have been more bold in telling it. Then, in my research at the library of Conrad Grebel University, by the way, did you know that they named their university after someone who went to 4 universities, got kicked out of one, dropped out of another, and never actually graduated from any of them? Now, I love to tell that to my friends at Grebel. So, anyway, at my research at Conrad Grebel University, and at an evangelical seminary, and at an ecumenical seminary, way too much seminary, I found out Anabaptists were sometimes somewhat contrary. And as one who likes to roam, that made me feel right at home. And then in 1990, my Mennonite world blew up, expanded, when 20,000 Mennos from all parts of the world descended on Winnipeg. Well, we shook our leg, we ate the bread, we drank the drag. More Mennos in Africa than Canada. I thought I died and went to heaven. Communion bread was multiplied without the leaven. Then in 2010, there was another phenomenon. A non-Mennonite Brit named Stuart Murray wrote a book. Who is this crook? Should we have a look? Well, in 2011, I went to England to have my look. In person. It's a naked Anabaptist. Should we pass the fist instead? He took off our centuries-old clothes and I suppose dressed us in those of postmodernism. Postmodernism? I'm scared of isms. Communism, fascism, racism, sexism, materialism, capitalism. But maybe, just maybe, the spirit of Anabaptism has something to say to us in the midst of our ism fray. Is it a movement whose time has come? Is Anabaptism something we can learn from? 500 years ago, the Anabaptists died for the freedom to choose their faith. 500 years ago, Anabaptists lived for the kingdom, only to lose their lives. 500 years ago, the Anabaptists died for their political rebellion. 500 years ago, the Anabaptists lived out their salvation as best as they knew how. And now, 500 years later, what are we dying for? 500 years later, what are we living for? One of my former students is also here, and he will hopefully remember that I introduced the course with that little poem, somewhat changed since then. At the time, my ending was a bit different. I said, I had the question where the students would be, I would vocalize what the students were asking, and they were asking, what is Anabaptism? And I would say, And that's what this course is all about. So what happened 500 years ago? Well, Hans Denk was implicated in the trial of the godless painters. It gets complicated. It went on all fall, actually, not just today, December 4th, 1524. It went on all fall. Who were these godless painters? Well, Sebald Baham, his brother Barthel, and their friend George. And what a story did they forge. They lived in Nuremberg, Germany. They go down in history with some infamy. So why were they considered godless? Well, that's what artists sometimes tend to be. And these three left too much skin showing on their biblical characters, you see. Too erotic, too risky. But what about Hans Denk? He was an Anabaptist. This could not be that he was with these three. Well, it was. You see, they were all friends with ideas. And ideas are dangerous. So what kind of ideas? Well, there was variety. We could call it heterodoxy. It was definitely all heresy. So what are some specific examples of these ideas? Well, there's more than three. Let's name a few. Number one, God is love. Okay, I can concede that is true, I concede. 2, Jesus exemplified divine love. Oh, but this love slope is slippery. 3, baptism is for adults who choose to love. I told you so! This is going too far. Number 4, you can sacrifice in love, but not kill in love. No more! This is ridiculous! But there is a 5. The church is those who covenant to love. Impossible. I may as well just say the 6th. And it's all free. God is free. Salvation is free. The church is free. And it's all applied universally. Each one can experience the divine mystery. But we'll have controversy and anarchy. This is dangerous and should never be. So, what happened to the 4th? Well, the trial dragged on. It was a bore. They got into all sorts of philosophical lore, endless theologizing and legalizing, enough to make one snore. And there was still that matter of that extra skin show. And the free-thinking ideas did upset the stability of Nuremberg. So they threatened them with jail, torture, and more. It was a big mess. So they decided to take a Christmas recess. And we'll hear the rest of the story after Christmas. With a bit of time travel. What else happened today, 500 years ago? The Tuesday disputations. Now I know today is Wednesday, December the 4th. Historians like to get picky about dates, but in 1524, Tuesday was December 6th and December 13th, so we couldn't hit that anyway with our dates, so Arlen and I just chose Wednesday, December 4th. But Tuesday, December 6th and Tuesday, December 13th were 2 successive Tuesdays in which they had formal public debates in the city of Zurich, Switzerland, where for the first time they had a public discussion of what came to be known as believers' baptism. Ulrich Zwingli, professor, priest, politician, public servant, and soldier, couldn't think of a P word that meant soldier, stood on one side, and his former students, who came to be nicknamed the School of Heretics, were on the other. What is the School of Heretics, you ask? Well, you'll have to read the book. So both of these events, the trial of the godless painters involving Hans Denk and the Tuesday disputations, were both precursors or things leading up to those events on January 21st, 1525, that has all Mennos in the world all up in excitement over various types of celebrations. But it's important to recognize that no one date happens in a vacuum. There's always a larger story, and that's why whenever I speak now in these days, I want to choose whatever dates are 500 years ago and focus on those. Because I'll keep going for a couple of years on important dates. And we can focus on different ones, and it keeps me amused, not only just talking about the same thing all the time. Anyway, let me read you my 500th anniversary part 1 and part 2, because those are or at least one of them is the event that most people are celebrating. So this is part 1. The evening of January 21st, 1525, a group of radicals took a dive, not into a tank or a lake or a river. That would have been a shiver in Zurich during winter. That evening of January instead was done quite secretly, for it was a forbidden act and a sober communal pact to separate from powers that be, to form a church that would be free from Christendom, with which they just could not jive. Part 2 is lesser known. And when I used to teach Anabaptist history and theology, I made pains to point out that the baptism service in Zurich, which gets all the press, wasn't the only thing that happened on the day. In fact, I would make students only memorize one date for the exam. It was January 21st, 1525. But then they also had to know both things that happened. And this is the other thing, which will conclude my previous little story about Hans Denk and the godless painters. That same evening, in January 21st, 1525, one more thing happened on that day in Nuremberg, some miles away. Mingling with an artists' guild, holding anti-establishment convictions and salvation with no restrictions. For that, Hans Denk was almost killed. They kicked him out of Nuremberg. True love, he cried, and on his way. And then if I would be reading this next year, this evening of January 21st, 2025, 500 years, we're still alive. We do not look like we did then. Split once, split twice, split thrice, times 10. Will we true love and learn to thrive? Here's the point that I am trying to make with those two, which I also tried to make in our class. The events in Nuremberg and Zurich were not related by social media. They were happening unbeknownst to each other in many ways. But these two events in different places symbolizes that there was a variety of Anabaptist expressions at its origins. It was a spontaneous grassroots movement happening in different places at the same time. The little date thing is just an illustration of this larger thing. And perhaps we should then not be surprised or lament that we have a variety of expressions today, but rather recognize them and embrace them. Whether it is international diversity, denominational diversity, or theological diversity, or any other kind of diversity. Unfortunately, in my view, we have often done the opposite, by claiming that our particular expression is the one that is the most authentic, or heaven forbid, the right one. So let me say a few things about the Tuesday disputations and the trial of the godless painters. Although much is made of this date, January 21st, 25, that was my publishing date for this book, so that people would be thinking about this anyway, and so on. But it is important, as I insinuated before, that we always see all big events in a larger context. The events of the fall of 1524 were also important. I had an event in Black Creek on the island on September 5th, which happened to be exactly 500 years since the first publication of the Articulation of Anabaptist Convictions by Conrad Grable. And so there's events all along, and so these are all connected, and we have to see this much bigger picture. No one thing happens in a vacuum. Nothing happens locally that is not impacted by larger events and processes, and that is true for each of our lives if we reflect on it. We are shaped by larger forces than just, we think that we are such independent thinkers, but we are shaped by much larger things as well. Events involving human beings are complicated and contain endless nuances. Even more so when involving religion and politics. And that is, the Anabaptist movement was both religious and political. And much more could be said. They offer entire courses here at CMU on this. Thank you, Carl. And there are many other Anabaptist institutions offer courses where these sorts of things are explored. Let me say a few things personally about the book. And then I like conversations, and conversations can go in any direction. So if you have questions or comments later, it looks like Arlen has set up a mic so even your voice can be recorded. That shouldn't intimidate you, though. Thank you. When I was teaching at college, I often said, in 2025, when January 21st comes around, we're going to cancel classes and have a big party. I will not teach you about that. We're just going to have a party to celebrate 500 years. Well, I am no longer teaching, so I'm having to make my own party. So I call this my party in a book. And so even though I have done much academic writing and much sermonizing, this book is watercolor paintings, poetry, and stories, rather than historical detail, although I do have a timeline, and it's rather than theological discourse, although I do include a sermon in here, and hopefully it does cause some theological thinking. By the way, my definition of theology is if you think about God and human life together, that's doing theology. So everybody's a theologian who thinks about God and life. I got that from my seminary professor who was a Baptist, who had his training at a Roman Catholic school and was teaching at an denominational seminary. Doug Webster, for anybody who knows theologians. Carl, you might have run across. Wonderful professor from St. Michael's in Toronto. Anyway, I just remembered that line from him last night in my notes. So I hope that what I have here will be a wonderful introduction for people who don't read a lot of theology, so an introduction to what Anabaptism is. It's not a systematic book, it's simply 15 pictures and 15 stories accompanying them of my experiences at the locations. And I also hope that it helps those who are history nerds to lighten up a little. Because history isn't known for lightening up. So I hope that it will do those two things, provide an introduction for people who aren't into history or Mennonite history or Anabaptist history, and also help those of us who sometimes take it too seriously just to lighten up and enjoy, celebrate, and have fun with it. So thank you again. My mind is blown as people walk in here because you represent so many different parts of my life. And so it's just really good to be here. I'm only standing up here because I have a mic, but I'd like to make it kind of conversational if you have questions or comments about the content of the presentation or about the process of the book or anything else. I'm open to talking about it together.
Gareth, I'm interested in knowing how you...
Perhaps you could introduce yourself before you speak, and then say how you're connected.
Abe Bergen, Mennonite World Conference, and Gareth Brandt. I'm interested in knowing how you got involved in the painting itself. How did you get there?
I guess I grew up kind of an artsy. I've always enjoyed various types of art and painting as a kid already. And then I took up watercolor painting when I was laid up from a knee surgery early in my marriage. And then when we were raising kids, you don't have time for hobbies. But I took it up again about 7 or 8 years ago when I was on an extended mental health leave from my work at college, and my therapist said that I should start doing Sudokus, and I just about vomited on the floor. Said, can I do something else that will help me to focus? Like she said that nothing against Sudokus if you do them. I'm married to somebody who does one daily, so it's all good. But anyway, it's just not me. But she wanted something that would be meditative. And so I said, can I take up watercolor painting again, which I left 20-some years ago. And that's when, and then I thought, what am I going to paint? So first of all, I painted all the houses we had lived in our years of marriage, just from photographs. And then I wondered what should be my next project. And I thought, I'll paint some pictures of the Anabaptist sites. Like, I love old barns and buildings and shacks and old churches and things that are my primary subject matter. So it's old, and there's also the story of how it's a new thing as well. Thanks.
My name is Josh Nightingale. I was a former student of Gareth's. And I was wondering about the attentiveness required in painting these sites that you visited. Did anything emerge from the experiences and practice of painting? Any insights or anything like that?
Thank you for that question. Yes, in a one-word answer. But theologians are like politicians. You can't just give a one-word answer. Art is a feeling discipline. And even my stories beside the paintings have kind of historical details of what happened there. but also express some of what I felt when I was there. And so with watercolors, you can't paint on site, outside, because of wind and those things that ruin it. So I painted off of photographs, but very much painted with recollecting how I felt when I was there. And sometimes my stories will also include a bit of that as well. Is that getting at what you were asking? So for me, even something like a sermon is a piece of art for me. I know there's a science of preaching called homiletics, but to me it's an art. And so that's why, for me, it's just natural. It's who I am to put art and painting and poetry and history and theology together. It's not everybody, but it just happens to be me.
I'm Ron Penner. I consider Gareth a personal friend. Also, we've been working in the church together, and so I'm not into painting, so my question will be regarding your, I appreciated your testimony on how you became conscientious or consciously chosen Anabaptist Mennonite. I like that. Now my question to you is, you've studied 500 years of history, of Anabaptist history. We are now close to the celebration of that event. Now, 500 years later, what is it that is worrisome to you about the Anabaptist movement or the Anabaptist church, and what is it there that gives you hope and see as truly a good future for us Mennonites, church people?
Whew, that's a huge...
Well, we got it there.
That's a huge question and an important one to reflect on. And hopefully, collectively, the 2 million or so around the world will do that, not just next year, but in the coming years. Obviously, my introduction told you one thing that I think is important for our 500 and moving forward. You asked for a concern or a worry and a word of hope. Yeah, my worry perhaps was not so thinly veiled when I talked about the diverse expressions. Because this is where I would like to sit in a conversation with everybody. I see COVID didn't have anything new happen in a sense, but it revealed, I think it was the great exposer of things that have always been there. And I think Mennonites, as other Christians or as other people, have been forced to reckon with polarization. And it has impacted us. And to use an old Mennonite phrase, I see that as the world creeping into the church. That sense of polarization, even though different expressions of the Anabaptist world have accused other expressions of being the worldly ones. So that's a bit of my worry, is that, you know, we've split lots of times already. One of the I didn't grow up in my present denomination. I joined it because I was excited that finally Mennonites were coming together and not separating. That was also true of my time at the college. Sadly, there have still been divisions and schisms. Anyway, I'll stop there for that. Hope. Josh Nightingale is what gives me hope. Sorry to point you out. It's not just you, but you happen to be here. Justin Sun, who wrote on the back of the book, gives me hope. Amy Van Bergen, who was a proofreader for me for the book, gives me hope. I dedicated the book to all my former students. My cousin Chris, who's on the younger end of the cousins from me, gives me hope. I'll end there.
Thanks for being here, Gareth. I'm Carl Coop, and I've really appreciated your sharing this evening. You shared your journey, some of your journey that brought you to Anabaptism. I'd be interested to know if there's a story to tell about this journey in Anabaptism. Maybe there have been some constants, but what have been the learning edges along the way? So when I think about, like, I've studied Anabaptism for a while, and I would say that the way I thought about it, 20 years ago or maybe 40 years ago, I'm at a different place, and there are different things that I'm drawn to that inspire me in ways that maybe weren't so much the case way back. So if you have something to share, I would be interested in hearing.
And I would say my perspective has changed even in the 2 years since I was a professor. I have a different perspective. And students change my perspectives. As much as I filled their heads with information and hopefully more so transformation, that also changed me. My first change, and I mention it briefly in the book, was my own college experience. The late Ben Hepner, not the singer, was my Anabaptist history professor way back. And I always thought Mennonites were a bunch of old-fashioned traditionalists. And then when I met Conor Grable and all the rest of the School of Heretics people, I was like, oh, like, maybe this isn't so bad. Maybe there's something that excites me. So I would say that was my first kind of turning point, is just an exposure to that. And that started I'm primarily a 16th century scholar. I don't know much about most of the 500 years of history. But that piqued my interest in origins. And then also a late professor at an evangelical seminary, Ian Rennie, knew more about my denomination at the time, which was Evangelical Mennonite Conference, than I did. And instead of trying to make me into a generic evangelical, he said, I want you to do a directed study on your own background. And one of the first assignments I gave to students, probably as a result of that advice, is that I wanted them to do a paper on their own theological tradition before I rammed Anabaptism down their throats, which of course pacifists don't do, but anyway. But I wanted them to, at least, even if they had left their tradition of their youth, at least learn a bit about it. And so to me, it's important. We all have contributions to make to each other. And for me, it was a tradition I grew up in and have claimed for my own as an adult.
Hi, Gareth. Chris Friesen, cousin of Gareth. Not the youngest cousin. I don't have that honor, although Gareth is my eldest cousin. One of your paintings still hangs in my dad's office of the house that he and your mother grew up in, that I think you gave him at some point many years ago. Thinking about your journey and your story and some of the questions that have been asked here about the current diversity of expressions, what do you say to 16-year-old Gareth, who struggled and was irked by the expression that he grew up in?
There's other ways. Yeah, and that of course is the young adult journey. my primary area of teaching, by the way, is spiritual formation. So I taught even Anabaptist history and theology in a sense, from a pastoral theology perspective. Yeah, I would just say, give it a shot. You can, you go anywhere you want in your journey, but find out where you're from and who you are and why your parents or your church did what they did and said what they said. You don't have to agree with it. That's not the point. The point is that you processed it. So I would encourage people somebody used the word conscious. Be conscious. To me, self-awareness is one of the greatest, I was going to say it's salvific. I'll say it's salvific. Self-awareness is very important, and part of that is understanding your own background and journey. Now I'm really going to be in school of heretics. Salvation is self-awareness. Luckily, I'm freelance, so I don't care if you tell me I'm a heretic. My job doesn't depend on it. Well, this is recorded, sorry.
Their controversy self-causes.
Or burns them. We were attempting to make it an hour, so if this lull is saying we are approximately there. Thank you so much for coming on a cold Manitoba day. I am coming through here again on a road trip. Hope to be in Manitoba the last 2 weeks of June. So if your church or your area of churches is doing something to celebrate 500, I am happy to be part of it. Right now, I will be in Saskatchewan, north of Saskatoon for a couple of weeks, but I have just started contacting people in Manitoba, so there's nothing better than in person. So yeah, if your church is after Christmas or talking about it, send an email and I'm happy to be part of it. And what I did in Calgary and Black Creek in September is just give me a venue for free, and you don't have to pay anything or do anything. I'll just do something for an hour on an anniversary event and have a bit of fun together, because I'm free, so we can do this. Thank you, Gareth.
Thank you for each of your engagement tonight. It's been a good conversation. Thank you. It has been recorded, as I said, and will be available to view at commonword.ca if others that you know would have interest in this conversation. Folks here will be able to chat with Gareth immediately afterwards at the table and have a book signed. The books are available in the store or at commonword.ca. But first, I would like to invite you to sit with Radical Roots, to reflect on its poetry, take in its simple watercolor paintings, and to read a story